that. Well, hey, welcome everyone to season 6 of ReggieCon, the con that keeps asking the question, what's your story? I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty. I'm a cognitive scientist philosopher here at Illinois State University. And tonight we come together to celebrate Latinx Heritage Month with a discussion of the amazing graphic novel, Monster Matador, Once Upon Some Monsters in Mexico. Joining me in tonight's discussion is a crew of pop culture aficionados. First, we're going to talk to Edcel Cintron Gonzalez. Edcel, please tell everyone who you are and what you do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Edcel Cintron Gonzalez, originally from the island of Puerto Rico. I'm a PhD candidate. Hopefully, I'll have my doctor title by next semester, fingers crossed. My work specializes in children's young adult literature, where I study contemporary children's media and literature in the aspects of mental health, where I specifically study the relationship between parents and children when having conversations about mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. And I also do a lot of work with Latinx literature, specifically contemporary Puerto Rican literature and hurricane narratives.
Very, very cool. Good to see you again, Edcel. I hope your semester's gotten off to a good start. Excellent. Next, we have Raven Moore, school psychology student from the Department of Psychology. Raven, please come in, tell everybody who you are and what you like about comics.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for the first on. I actually am just getting into comics with Monster Matador here. So this was a really great introduction for me. I'm usually a little bit more into like anime, so my favorite anime I would say is like Demon Slayer. But yeah, so this is going to be my first comic, and I was really excited to dive in. And
that's fantastic. So glad you're willing to join us here. And ladies and gentlemen, now it's my dear pleasure to welcome the one and only Stephen Prince. Prince, tell everybody a little something about who you are, what you do.
I am the writer and creator of Monster Matador, and I'm happy to be back at ReggieCon. Last year was a lot of fun, and looking forward to discussing it, the latest story. No,
that's fantastic. We're so glad to have you back. We had such a great time talking about the story last year. We thought we'd I met you at San Diego when you had a new book, right? Yeah. So let's go ahead and do it. So before we go further, I quickly want to take a moment, if I can. Yeah, let me just do this first. That'll work. Let me see if this works. Let me see. So are you guys seeing all of that? Are you guys seeing Monster Matador, the cover and the picture of everyone? Okay, I'm just making sure because I'm trying to manage all this here and I don't actually see everything you see. So this is our 6th season at ReggieCon, and we're delighted to be able to do these virtual once a month discussions. For anyone who's not familiar, the purpose of ReggieCon, we get together once a month on a virtual panel. It used to be in Zoom. Now it's in a Teams webinar where we celebrate the History Heritage Month being celebrated nationally with a discussion of a graphic novel or a piece of work that's relevant to that theme. So again, this month in celebration of Latinx Heritage Month, we're doing Monster Matador, Once Upon Some Monsters in Mexico, excuse me. I just want to give a shout out to these people that behind the scenes who really help us do what we do. Mr. Sean Thornton has been doing our covers, which you can see behind me. He's been doing those for years. He's amazing. Thank you so much, Sean. Dr. Jana Albrecht, she's runs the Office of Enrollment Management and Academic Services. They have funded ReggieCon. This will be their 6th year, and we're very, very, very grateful for their help. ReggieCon is also funded by what's called the Sage Trust Fund, which is an organization or a foundation the university uses to fund speaker issues phenomena just like this. And then we have Somer Simmons, who works in Jana's office and helps us with the logistics. Tracy Wygren, I'm sorry, that's not a picture of Tracy. That's the former person in her position, but Tracy Wygren basically is Sean's supervisor over marketing, and we work with her to make sure everything works out properly. Miss Kelly Harmon is the lead staff in the Department of Psychology. She makes sure all the monetary logistics are managed properly. And then Miss Julie Manet Perez works in marketing as well, and she helps us out with our 30-second reels that we use to advertise ReggieCon events. So thank you very much to all of them. Now I'm going to, I thought I could stop sharing. There you go. And now it's back to us. And that's what you all see, right? It's just us. Cool. No, okay. I got checked out. Well, I want to explain a little something about, before we get into tonight's ReggieCon, because what's been happening the last semester and then now is that students in my senior seminar, Psychology 392, Welcome to Otherland, a game, a course of life. Otherland is a gamified course that tries to teach students a particular philosophy, and they practice that philosophy through graphic novels. And I won't go into the philosophy other than say it's what I would call thorough relationality. So we look through the relational nature of the images, the relational nature between characters, the relational nature of the different arcs in the story. And so a bunch of my students are here. They're going to be asking questions, and a lot of those questions are going to have to do with othering. And othering usually gets a sort of psychosocial definition. Just so we're all clear, one of the things I try to focus on is in a particular frame. We'll go through tonight, is we see a frame or a page in a comic book. The meaning of any one of those phrases is being contextualized and constrained by every other image on that page. And that's the artist's task, is to imbue that page with maximum referentiality, maximum relationality, with the fewest number of frames possible. So some of the students might be asking frames question. I suspect most of them will be asking, psychosocial type questions. So what we do here on ReggieCon, if you're not familiar, is that I've asked each of my panelists to pick a favorite frame or page from the book. I will put that frame or page up for everyone to see, and they'll discuss it and tell us why, and that will lead to discussion. Since we have a fairly reasonable sized crowd here, we might be able to have students ask questions after one of the panelists presents a frame. If it gets too unwieldy, then I'll have to hold the audience questions off until the end. But we'll see what we can do. So Edcel, we're going to start with you, okay? And I'm going to say, this is you had this, correct? And so you had 3 frames, right? Or 3 pages. Okay, cool. So take your time, say what you want to say.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the different frames for a variety of reasons. I picked this one in particular because there were going to be a lot of loss of hope, and I was thinking a lot of this when we thinking of the concept of othering as well, because as a Puerto Rican, especially coming to the U.S., I've suffered my share of discrimination, and it's also thinking of like how othering can also be perceived as that kind of collective consciousness of helplessness as well, being through a lot of different social events, a lot of different discrimination. In my case, surviving Hurricane Maria and kind of seeing the wreckage of like natural phenomenons like, oh, genial, another earthquake. Every time hurricane season comes along, I always think, oh, great, another hurricane. Let's see if this one takes out the Caribbean. So it's kind of like that strong sense of hopelessness that I feel, and the questioning of hope, that something that is constantly challenging us as humans and humanity to hold on to on the face of adversity. But then it's also interesting how these natural phenomena and outside forces keep challenging that notion within us. And I like to think of othering in that same scope as well. So those are some of the ideas that I really liked about this panel. And I really like the colors and the zoom in framing, like help, the plea for help, and kind of like no one is there, and then kind of like praying for God and holding up to our spirituality and religion, which is very Latinx culture embedded too. So those are a lot of the things I really enjoyed about this panel that made me think a lot in that aspect.
Do you want me to go to the next image as well, or is your commentary about all of them?
In the other images, and I think in this one, I kind of I think this one's backwards, so we can go to the other image first.
Oh, this one here first?
Yeah, because
Okay.
this one it made me think more of childhood trauma in that sense. Because
Yeah.
I really like the spacing a lot, that the sequence of action illustrations were in the comic book. And especially how this started when he was a child. Then he was all alone except one of them. They were always there calling, watching. He hated them, feared them. He grew older and moved beyond. So I like how the narrative and the illustrations kind of create this nice storyline, but it also sets the tone for what we know as trauma, and how that can also be another example of othering when we want to think
Mm.
about it in terms of, you know, what causes us that deep emotional pain that we revert back to within our childhood self that still affects our adult version of ourselves. And really, and for me as a short lit scholar, I like to think of it as a conversation of how us as the adult always have a constant conversation with our childhood self when we go back to different notions of what reminds us of that, whether that's nostalgia, for example, whether that's different lived experiences, and how can we move forward from that and learn from that. So that lead me to the other image, which is the a second one,
Yep.
where it's kind of
Yeah.
yeah, where it kind of like snaps back to reality and kind of like facing, the now and kind of like those challenges that we see beforehand. So that was like the what interesting a lot about these different panels, but also cohesively how that's also merging with reoccurring themes throughout the story.
Fantastic. And did you want to relate that to this one, or did you say what you wanted about that?
I did. And I'm
Okay.
really interested to hear about also people's thoughts, audience thoughts, just because I don't know, like illustration wise, I really like the textures and kind of like, I mean, I can even notice the dust happening and kind of like, I feel like I'm immersed within the destruction, like having survived like a catastrophic event myself. I really feel myself there, kind of like, damn, I've survived this. I know what this means,
Yeah, yeah. No, I love it. So, Stephen, did you want to respond to what Edcel said there?
Sure. It's you pick up on a big theme of the book, which is trauma, and how that's sort of carried through life, and how from childhood how that can affect moving forward. And with the Matador, one of the things about this story, in the storyline prior to this, he's the Matador. He fights the monsters, and he's fearless, and he's this macho guy. And in this story, what we start to do is we start to chip away at that, and to show the readers that this is just kind of an armor that he's been wearing, you know. And as the story goes along, we show also how that trauma gets passed along to his daughter. And in the beginning of Once Upon Some Monsters in Mexico, you see there's a scene with the daughter and the Matador, and she's kind of learning how to fight a bull, and she wants to be just like him to fight. And you see that sort of how trauma can kind of lead to sort of toxicity, so those are definitely themes that are very much a big part of it. So
Yeah, no, and Steven, I really like how you mentioned toxicity too, and this is interesting because it reminded me of another conversation I had with a friend of mine, because we were talking about The Last of Us recently, and kind of like how that ongoing revenge narrative is embedded in trauma, but then how can that also kind of like the toxicity or taking over someone's humanity in order to seek that revenge. So I'm thinking a lot of Ellie and Abby's narrative, for example, in The Last of Us Part 2 as an example of that. And I can really see that forming within your work as well.
Yeah,
And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that trauma being a central theme of this comic and slowly chipping away at that armor, because I think in the frame where he has a bit of a stumble in the fight when he's approached directly head on with that trauma, we see like why he has that armor on, because immediately the luchadores are like, are you sure you are who you say you are? When
Right.
he has that one moment of weakness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's very much, you know, we build up these myths and these kind of like I said, the armors and legends and whatever. And the way these things tend to work is that, you know, in life, in real life, you know, you'll see it like where it's this one little moment, this one little thing will just break down, you know, people like that. And you don't necessarily know when it's going to come or where it's going to come from. And because you're so used to this image or this idea in your head of this person being this great thing, and then you see that emotion, it's kind of like, wait a minute, you know, that can't be the same person, you know.
Right.
It's a lot of why you don't hear a lot of politicians, you know, you're not supposed to cry in public, you're not supposed to show emotion in public, and every time a politician has a tear, suddenly he's human, you know, it's humanity or whatever. But it's the same kind of thinking of how we kind of construct these things really to hide the trauma that we have inside ourselves.
No, that's absolutely the case. I got a question for Edcel from John Butler. Edcel, the frame about trauma really showed how emotional energy and trauma just doesn't disappear. It reorganizes who the person becomes. So from a, well, I'm going to say from a wild systems theory perspective, and you don't have to, you know, that fear becomes part of his system shaping how he reacts to the world later. What do you think about that? Can you see the chat? Edcel, I don't know if you guys can see the chat.
Yeah,
Okay,
I can.
so you can read that if you want, and you don't have to necessarily reference wild systems theory, but you know, while Edcel's coming up thinking about this, what I will say is there are pretty clear neurophysiological data that there are changes associated with the brain in trauma. So, for example, in certain types of trauma, you've got an over-innervation of certain sensory areas in the brain that develop as a function of trauma. And these, of course, what lead to the startle responses when people hear the, you know, a loud noise and experience it as a gun. It's because we say they're hypervigilant. Well, the neural explanation is that their sensory areas have been over-innervated due to the experiences that they had before. So that's all very real. Go ahead, Edcel.
Yeah, no, this is thank you so much to John for the question. That's very fascinating, and it's reminding me a lot of the research I did for Comic-Con with Attack on Titan, Wild Systems Theory. But thinking again, it's really interesting because if my research in children's lit, I don't get to see that happening. But if I think about young adult or anime, for example, of how that trauma becomes part of the character's identity and how we actually see that character grow, whether we see that character, for example, either process that trauma and really become that whole wholesome character, and that's a positive change in the world, or it takes the other perspective that, you know, resorts to violence because of the trauma bond and wants to seek that personal vendetta because they want to achieve something as a response to that trauma. I definitely agree of how that energy itself is shaping the character, and the character using that energy to give back to the world, whether that's a positive or negative, is still that affectation happening.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead. Did you want to say something, Stephen?
No, I think it's interesting because you see a shift, and anime is now becoming a bigger thing, and the way characters deal with these things is much different than, you know, typical Western way of it. Because in Western, typically, you know, Hollywood, whatever, trauma is like the strength of the character, right? They don't really shed it. It's what propels them, and they don't really
Right.
like overcome it. They use it, you know, which is again toxic because
No, you're
not
absolutely
getting to
right.
the root of the problem. And it's interesting to see the shift to sort of Eastern style, manga anime storytelling, which is different because they actually work to overcome, they recognize and overcome those traumas through you know, through the storylines. It's just a different structure, narrative structure.
And culturally, it has something to say culturally about how a culture deals with the trauma of individuals. For example, you know, Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca, and the sort of stoic man who never really reveals his emotions. Those were all real responses to coming home from World War I, right? And just seeing the the absolute horror of the trench warfare that took place in World War I. And so that was the vibe, is to be stoic. And now when you have young men and women who come back from fighting in the Middle East and find themselves traumatized, we seem to be a little more open to it as a culture, yet these people nonetheless still suffer very much alone. And we struggle as a culture when we simultaneously train a group of people to be our standing army or whatever we want to call it, while simultaneously not giving them therapy when they come back from patrols, right? I mean, not actually engaging their suffering in that moment, and basically having a system of training that trains them to be stoic in the moment. But then when we come home, we celebrate, but they're already been told they got to be stoic. And it's this huge contradiction that I think leaves many soldiers isolated, completely misunderstood, and that has something to do with the suicide rate of the young people who came back from the Middle East, right? Absolutely. John Butler responded to you. So thanks for your answer. I agree. It's interesting to see the character arcs from people as they work through their trauma. Sabrina Will has a question. Would you say, all right, so this is for everyone. I guess this is more about comics in general. Would you say in the frames where the people are empty, that they feel like they lost what they're about or their embodied context? So I wonder if she's referring to one of the images you showed it, like at the bottom. Let me share this real quick. So at the bottom of this frame here, I don't know if that's what you're referring to as being, yes, it was that picture. So in that picture, right, you've got the bottom of that frame. I don't know, can you guys see my pointer? Like it's part of the image right here where they're empty. The question is, do you think like they've lost their aboutness and or embodied context? In other words, is this, or Stephen, when you wrote this and then you saw these images, is this what you were asking for from the illustrator? And what were you trying to get across with this sort of one-dimensional depiction of the characters?
So I'll give Fabio credit. Fabio Alves, who's the artist, who unfortunately does not speak English, so he couldn't join us. But generally, I script, and we've been working together long enough now. But I'll script basically panel descriptions. But I'll leave the sort of the way he did that last panel as a silhouette. And I think, and Alex Zeff, who's the colorist, inverted it to have it white against red.
Okay.
Was a choice that they made artistically, and I think it works really well with the dialogue there, because it's the luchador who is, telling the matador, who is now, again, like say, he's lost his sense of who he is and himself and his purpose. He's saying, you shouldn't pretend about this stuff. You shouldn't. And it's a contrast to everything above, and really pops and places the focus.
All right.
So it's a definite graphic choice from the artist. But I think it works really well because it does get across the sense that he's lost his purpose.
Yes. No, that's fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and go on to Raven's image. Give me just a second here. This thing is not the fastest. All right, so Raven, I believe these are yours. Please tell me if I'm correct. All right, and if I've cut off too much content there, I'll go ahead and reframe the frame.
These are up. So I chose the frames with the grackle and the dog. So the grackle's kind of looking over the city, looking for the dog so that he can come up and steal his food for the umpteenth time. So when I first saw this frame, I initially thought that this was a really funny scene. But then I started thinking more about like why is this funny? And to me, I think it's the inevitability of what will happen and the fact that we know it will happen and the power in that. And when I thought more deeply about this, it made me think about the context of the scene and ecological systems theory and the how it's related to our current social and economic climate. The Grapple's world has been unchanging, despite the world below him falling apart and turning to literal trash and giant cockroaches. His life pretty much just gets easier, and he seeks opportunity, and other people struggle and the chaos of it all. This is similar to how there's a lot of money in the world falling apart. And he could definitely find his own meal, especially with his bird's eye view, right? But he takes the dogs because he can, and he delights in taking advantage of the dog, even though he knows that the dog is starving. Similar to how instead of raising employee wages, someone decided that we need to start tipping everywhere now.
Everywhere, exactly. Stephen, you have first dibs responding to that.
All right. Yeah, it's an interesting take on the scene. For me, when I wrote it, it's about, and I think what you said is a really good observation. And I like that things can be interpreted different ways. For me, it was, first of all, this opening was influenced by the opening scene of a film called Santa Sangre, which is directed by Alejandro Jodorowsky. And Jodorowsky talks a lot about trauma in his works and philosophy, and the circular nature of it, and how you have to break those circles in order to move past trauma. And so this idea here was in the sense that this happens every day. It's a literal circle, and the dog has, in a sense, the power to break that circle, right? But it's the trauma of this bird doing it day in and day out, and this sort of anger that he has to kind of, I don't know, best the bird or beat the bird at his own game, that they keep going through the cycle, right? And he continues to be traumatized by this bird over and over and over and over and over again. So that was kind of some of the thought behind it. And from the bird's point of view, it's like, say, even though the city, it's, the destruction and everything, he still is able in life, and like the scene right after with the characters, that in order to sort of survive, they have to find these small moments that give them joy, that allow them to sort of move forward, So
yeah. Did you want to go ahead?
Oh. For you, and when you were thinking about it and writing about it, you were thinking about how the dog has the power to get out of this position.
Right.
I was thinking about it from the perspective of the power dynamic between the crow, or between the grackle and the dog. The fact that he literally has that bird's eye view to where he has that advantage, and even if the dog wanted to, right, the grackle could just catch him on any corner because he would be able to find him. So
right.
Thank you for giving me that perspective, because I think with that, definitely I was thinking about it differently.
Yeah, and that's kind of the beauty of this stuff, is that like it can mean a lot of different things, and they're all, I mean, I think what you said, I was like, oh, that's really kind of cool, like way to look at it.
I like what both of you said, and I like the idea. For me, this little, I'm going to call it bird dog cycle, is not unlike the monster Matador cycle, in the sense that these monsters just keep coming back. And I like Raven's comment about inevitability, right? Yeah. And what I mean by that is these two cycles exist at different scales. Right, you got a dog and a bird, and you've got these huge monsters and humans, and one could take this. It's almost as if the bird and the dog is kind of a parable that spells out what's supposed to happen for the rest of the story. Right. For me, it's the idea that the work never continues, and there's no such thing as a power vacuum. Right. Once you have organisms of any type in a space, there's a power vacuum, or there's a power structure. And the idea that one system that's capable of taking something from another system, consuming another system's energy or whatever it is, has options, but chooses the one that involves the other, really turns the exchange into a form of oppression, psychosocial oppression, right? You could easily go somewhere else and get your energy if you're the bird. I don't know, maybe the rest of the world there, I don't know. But if it's possible that you could go somewhere else, but you still impose your energy upon a system that can't really compete and take its, that means you're sort of, it's not even apex predator behavior, it's just maniacal sociopathy. Right? And I like the idea that it's a bit of a parable. It doesn't have to be the parable I just said, right? But it's this idea of this cycle persists, and maybe thinking of life in terms of this kind of cycle is not a bad idea.
Yeah, that makes sense too. Yeah, it's
cool.
That's great. Yeah.
So, Edcel, you're more than welcome to chime in if you want on what we were just saying. If you don't want to, that's cool. I'm just being a good host. Cool. All right, so what I'm going to do is this. Dr. Roldan's here, so I'm going to go try to, I've turned off her mic. Dr. Roldan, would you turn on your microphone and your camera and come on in? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, turn on your camera if you can.
I'm trying.
All right, cool beans. Now I'm thinking, I've got to figure out how to get you into my, I'm just making noise. There you go. See if I can move you.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Okay, so can you guys all see Dr. Roldan? Say yes or no, or do you, like at the bottom of the screen, there's a 1-3. Maybe you gotta go over to the second or third window. I'm trying to make sure we can see you.
I see.
Did you go over to the third window to find it?
Yeah, it's on the.
Yeah. All right. So I want her, because this is being taped, right? So I want her to be in the same scene as. I'm just going to assume this is going to work out, Sarah. Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm not sure how to move you. All right. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit about what you do.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Roldan. I'm a clinician, a therapist by trade, and I'm also a professor at San Diego State University, where I teach science and general studies with comics and video games. That's my cup of tea. And I'm here because last year I also was honored to have a participation in the comic book, which I adore for multiple reasons that we can talk about today. And mostly is because I use comics to treat severe trauma or to talk about belonging and community. And as a Latina and somebody that teaches Latinx studies, this comic has been very crucial for make those hard conversations.
Well, that's fantastic. So I think what I'm actually going to do is go to your images, if that's okay. We've gone through Edcel's and Raven's, and you actually picked an image that Edcel picked, but we'll be, since you didn't hear what he said about it, we'll be excited to hear what you think about it. So give me just a second to get this. There you go. That's good. Now let me make sure this is good. All right. So you can all see that, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so Sarah, the floor is yours.
I love the imagery of this particular page or panel. If I were to use it, this one is one that I will use to talk about how torture you can be with your childhood trauma. And also there is a study that is called ACE, that is child adverse experiences. And this is just chest kiss to explain that and open that conversation. And the graphics, if you ask anybody that has gone through any kind of evacuation or in fire, so anything like that, anything that has been traumatic, you get shell shock like this. And that's why without even reading the text, just the imagery was so powerful to talk about that.
So that we did talk about it somewhat in terms of trauma when it came up. Stephen, did you want to? Stephen, Edcel, Raven, did you want to? Oh, now I've got Sara in front of me. Very cool. I'm seeing you all now. Very good. Do any of you want to respond to Dr. Roldan?
So it's interesting because I was thinking of the previous audience question about the embodied context or aboutness in this image. And I just find it fascinating thinking about this idea now because it does make for a really good transition from, the strong adult figure reverting back to its child self. And this is like a really good example of this and how, with the I was gonna say black and white, but like with the darker colors, kind of assuming kind of presenting flashback moment, past memory. But I really like how it further emphasizes too, kind of like that idea that with some impactful moments, we really can't disconnect or disengage with that conversation between the adult self and the child self. And that's a really powerful aspect I love to study and always analyze when I really go for children's literature media in terms of where does that connect and how can that be evoked further. So this is really fascinating, and it really further emphasizes the power of comics on how these illustrations really can create an impact and make us realize these theoretical ideas and frameworks.
I wanted to quickly follow up on Edcel's comment. I'm glad we revisited this page because one of the things we talk about in the class is visual othering. What I mean by that is when you look at this page, the meaning of every one of those frames is not just in itself, but it's constrained and contextualized by all the other frames on that page. And the Gestalt psychologists were the ones who sort of talk this way about how it is that we even perceive anything. What I noticed looking through that image probably the fourth or fifth time is in the bottom middle image where the eyes are directed to the ceiling and there's a scream, and then there's all this debris around it, right? That debris, the black spots, it becomes extremely eerie because it surrounds that scream. If that scream weren't there, they would just be black dots, right? And the black dots make the scream feel more existential in the sense that it looks like the boy's dissolving, right? It looks like parts of him are falling apart. And you can see when you look at the cockroach in the hand close up, that's when, first of all, and the top in the middle is where you see debris on the wall behind his head. And then you see his hand reaching out in the third frame. And then in the fourth frame, his hand gets close to the cockroach and the debris starts. And then it just surrounds him to some extent. What I love about that kind of stuff is people really don't know that it's working on them, but they feel what it's supposed to do. And that sort of relationality where the dots aren't just dots and the face isn't just a face, but the two are about each other and constraining what it means when we see it. That's something that you can really spend a lot of time in with comics. Now, you can do it in movies as well, right? But I love the challenge of the still work and making things be densely relational in a single page.
And may I add also the text that what as he said, as he grew older and moved beyond this prison, he put that fear away, which is a very amazing way to explain, for example, clients that are suffering from trauma. For example, let's say this particular person developed a trauma that it create a phobia in any kind of insects. And this is how I explain them, like, if you notice all the debris and everything that is happening in the panels, the main participant, they almost like the focus of your attention is the cockroach. In the beginning, it was not, and then the cockroach came almost like crawling on you, like the feeling, right? So you can explain a lot of things with like the cockroach can be the representation of all that debris and that grief that we just swallow and put it down, and kind of it appears and multiplies in multiple ones. And how we compartmentalize a lot of traumas that we have as children that develop in other behaviors that are maladaptive, such as phobias, pushing your feelings down. And this is a good exemplification in our male gaze and in our male constructed, how we push feelings, especially in Latinos or in Hispanic communities. And you're a male, we don't feel. We just push it down, like it says in there, but it never left him. Because if you don't heal it, it never leaves you. So that's, I love this panel, like just to put it over there and like frame it and say trauma 101. You know, so yeah.
So this was
how pushing down trauma often happens, because that's something that really stood out to me about these frames was in the first frame, him being hollowed out, and he basically just becomes his context. And I think that that's what happens, right, when you don't deal with trauma, is that you just become your context, and dealing with it, you rediscover who you are. So I think it's interesting how he's hollowed out in the first one, and then he gets his aboutness back in the next frame, and more throughout the story.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to go to Dr. Roldan's next frame.
This one I love for multiple reasons. One, as Latinos, we love the whole novela drama. And this is like a representation TNT of that, of your romance. And then also the representation of how we honor our dead and how they stay with us forever. And how, if you notice, we have again that whole brown kind of like dark cloud that it follows the lost, the grief. And then the grief is not the person that we lost itself, is what it happens to us afterwards, right? And that's what I like about this frame, because it represents that, and how he is reaching to her and saying how he misses her and stuff. But if you notice, she's come of a light for him. And again, the whole hollow pieces of them when they were together versus when they were separate. And like I said, for those two multiple reasons, I like this frame and what it represents for us as Latino communities, or just as somebody that has grief, lost somebody, can totally relate to this, and how sometimes we forget too, when people has hurt us, and we kind of just put them as angels and stuff like that, or like very white, clean memory of them. So that is something that I will utilize to explain those stages of grief.
No, that's fantastic. Stephen, did you want to respond?
Yeah, no, that's it's nice, you know, that those things get picked up on, because you know, thematically, as the story moves along, one of the things we explore is death, and how the relationship he has in you know, with those that he's lost and whatnot. And his wife is someone who keeps coming back to him, kind of, you know, he's never really left her, and she's still kind of his rock or whatnot, and helps him. So
anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, I also like the vulnerability it also engages in the panel as well, especially thinking of the conversations, especially Ramon being this beacon, you know, this hero and this beacon of strength for the whole community, and kind of like how oftentimes heroes can't show vulnerability because that would mean that will mean that the rest of the community will lose hope if they ever see any aspect of them being vulnerable, meaning that, oh, they won't be strong enough to defeat the enemy, we're all doomed. So that doesn't really leave them as a way to check in or check up on their own feelings or mental health in that sense. So I really like this scene because, especially thinking of like, the male community in Latinx culture, growing up always saying that you have to be strong, you can't afford to cry, you can't afford to present yourself as vulnerable to the world because then people perceive you as weak and not capable of doing anything in the world. So, but again, with that offset narrative, it also doesn't leave any space in order to feel that humanity in that sense. So that's why I like these conflicts, and I like to think of them a lot as like, every time I teach gender the humanities and kind of like the importance of like how culture really takes a huge conversational aspect in this as well. And I like to use this every time I talk about Puerto Rican literature and Latinx literature in general too. So again, I like how Sara also mentioned the novela aspect because it's very much that growing up with the culture, but it's also interesting kind of like how we're breaking away from the gender stereotypes that novellas often provide us as well, and how it is that male mental health is something to be talked about, and it's something that needs to be shown in literature and in media as well. It kind of breaking away that stigma that's very harmful. And me thinking as an adult man, as a Latino, that's something I want to think about and advocate for every time and talk about in my spaces and classes as well.
Well, thank you for saying all that, Edcel. When you are in a position of leadership, you are playing a role that's different from the people who are not in leadership, and so much of how we interact with each other is not conscious. It's not verbal, and when you're stressed and you have a leader, and the leader looks stressed, it makes it difficult for you to not become more stressed. And when a leader is working hard to not be stressed and lead or do what they have to do, it's very hard to maintain that when everybody else is losing their mess, right? So training teams, part of training teams is keeping people open-minded and keeping their act together, right? And that's, yeah, and any of you who are going to be leaders or administrative leaders or something, your job is to be chill. And the thing is, people who are leaders, what they end up doing is hanging out with other leaders in a different place where their people they're leading don't see them, and they let their guard down. They explain what it feels like to be in that. They share their struggle. They laugh and blah, 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 blah. But yeah, and the idea, yeah, I like this idea quite a bit. And to be honest, if we're going to expect people in a culture to be leaders, then I think they need to hear this story. And I think we all need to hear this story, right? In the sense of some people are playing certain roles at certain times. And if the group's going to do anything well, those roles have to be respected. And if they're not respected, it's going to deteriorate group performance. Yeah, leadership's a big deal for me, man. And I appreciated this image. Anyone else want to comment on this one or follow up on?
I wanted to go ahead and respond to what you said, Edcel. I really relate to, vulnerability for men being a taboo. Obviously, we get some of that same messaging in the Black community as well. And I think what really stood out to me about these frames was in the previous ones where he's getting ridiculed for showing that weakness in front of other people. And this one, it's okay. And I think that that's true for a lot of Black and Latino men, that when it comes to those relationships with their romantic partners, in those spaces, that's when it's okay to break down those walls and to become vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I may add also that in our cultures, in the Black culture or even in the Latino we are matriarchal. So the softness, the female part is so embedded in us and so deep. But when we come in switch code, right? Code switching, and then we come to this other culture where we have to be the toughest, we have to be the machos, we have to be all the things except feelings, right? And that's also why I picked this in particular, because I work with a lot of military and first responders, which is pretty much him, right? That's why I love so much of this comic, because they're like, oh yeah, you're a warrior, there you go. And they can relate to this because when they're in deployment or when they're in any of their assignments, they are not allowed to lose it when they have something that triggers them or something that makes them think about what happened in their lives or who they have lost. They don't have time for that. And how you were saying, Scott, that when we have these leadership teams, we forget that all of us, there is two facts in life. We are going to lose somebody, and everybody has gone through something. Those are two facts that cannot be denied, right? So when and how, due to history and oppression and systems that are broken, our males have lost the ability to feel and to express those feelings. That's why I love this comic or lucha libre comics, because they are more kind of like catered to the male, but not. They are more to their feelings in a way that is safe and it doesn't feel judged. But a great reminder that everything through our history is through the matriarchal, soft and love. So that is something that we don't have for our males in this time and frame. We don't have something that can give them that fuzzy feeling inside, you know. And that's why I appreciate these frames.
Amazing. This is not the conversation I thought we'd be having tonight. I'm gonna ask. Stephen looks like he has something he wants to say.
No, that's great.
It's interesting culturally. Anything I say is going to be a generalization, right? Because if you're going to use the word culture, it's going to be a generalization. The challenge is, if this is true, are we changing the culture in which we're expecting young men to be this way? In other words, this way of being male and female, and I don't mean to generalize, but we're using words, right? These things, these patterns, these practices emerged in a different cultural context than we're living in right now. And, you saw everybody you lived with every day 50 years ago. You saw all the people who constrained your daily life 50 years ago, or most of them anyway. But now you don't really even see or feel a lot of them. And I think what happens is we may be, in a sense, trying to carry on a tradition that the current cultural context just isn't affording in a way that it used to. I'll just throw that out there and see if it blows up.
I mean, that's, you see that in the world. It's part of a big struggle, right, that we're seeing. I don't know how political you want to get, but
now say what's on your mind.
You had, the defense secretary go up in front of all the military leaders saying, we've got to be macho, we've got to be men, we've got to be strong, we can't show emotion, we can't do this. And then you have the left saying, no, we need to actually talk about these things because we have to help people work through their trauma. Because when, you see it all, unfortunately, you see it every now and then. There will be, there was a shooting, I think a couple of weeks ago, a former military, whatever. And, these are very real things that, again, are hidden until something bad happens because we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to show it because if we show it, then it means we're weak and our enemies will see us as weak because, we're supposed to be going to war and fighting and being soldiers and being, Spartans or whatever. So it's very much like, the struggle that continues. And, for me, I as I write, I have kids now. I grew up too, where, men were very macho. You didn't show emotions. My parents were immigrants. And a lot of it was, a lot of it too is when you're an immigrant, you're trying to fit in, right? Because you are an other. And part of that fitting in is not showing that emotion. You want to show that you're part of it. And,
right.
Everything's going to roll off your back and whatnot, all the insults or whatever. You're just going to keep moving forward. But now, as, I always say, like, when my kids or other, the schools now, they talk about mental health and and therapy and all these things, and it's very open. But growing up, when I went to school, it was not talked about. And things like ADHD, things you recognize in people, even adults, that you go, oh, they probably have this or that, or that's just something that was never really worked on because we ignored those things growing up, or adults ignored those things. Whereas now, there are paths to allow people to actually, work through them, help them overcome these things. But there's that constant struggle, right, between, whatever you want to call it, a side that just wants to put up the armor and pretend like it doesn't exist. And then another side who's saying, no, wait, we have to actually kind of do this because if we want to survive.
Right. Well, I'll just say this, and this is an apolitical comment. It's a systems theoretical comment. Anybody that espouses simplicities as givens and should be's is not complex enough for what they're doing.
Right.
It's Shakespeare every day. Everywhere, every day it's Shakespeare. Full of conflict, full of beauty, full of ugly. And if you can't speak that way, or at least speak in ways that acknowledge the beautifully ugly nature of everything, i.e. speak with a wee tad of grace, you're actually exposing your lack of complexity. And but there may be a bunch of people that are resonating with that simplicity. I'll leave it at that, right? But it's how you look like you have something you want to say. No, okay, I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Just to add to that, in every war, whatever you call it, war, intellectual or emotional war, we always go to simplicity because your brain is a very beautiful thing, but it's also very dumb sometimes. Like it just to keep you in what is simple. In othering is easier. Othering is easier because I don't have to think about your needs, wants, and what you're struggling with. Because if I know what you're struggling with, which the comic does a very well thing, doing that, what a hero will struggle with, we don't want to think about that. I just want you to go kill the bad guys or the bad things, and I will be okay. Kind of like when we say, if you know where your food comes from, you will not eat it. Kind of thing, because we don't think about those little things. And when I appreciate, not only because today is October 6th, and today we commemorate the loss of many indigenous people in our states. This kind of conversations that we have, look at we went from politics, from childhood trauma to generational trauma, just with 2 panels in a comic book. And the fact that people think that this is not history. Comic books are history. And not only history, they're also resembles of the things that we cannot say completely aloud. Because it's easier to put, like, in a comic, a hero having feelings that going in front of everybody and told them not have feelings. You know what I mean? Like, for my, I know this kind of conversations with 1 page or 2 that we have from a comic book like this, they mean more than having 2 hours of speech or 3 hours of speech that doesn't relate to them at all. But if from everybody that is listening or will watch it later, take this from this comic books. They're books. They're books of history. They're books that we have almost like a view of a journal of the human condition.
Well said. Anybody else want to respond to that? Okay, here's what I got. I got 2 questions. I have 2 questions and I have my frame. So I think we'll do the 2 questions and then we'll go to my frame. So Sierra asks, do you think the way leaders are expected to hide their emotions creates a kind of othering where they're seen as separate or even less human than the people they lead? Okay, so guys, I'm a former military officer. I'm not going to lie to you. You are trained to be last. When you are a military officer, you are trained, your troops come first, you eat last, you clean their feet if someone needs their feet cleaned. Not as relevant as it was in earlier systems of war, but that is the officer creed. I mean, traditional Western armies, the officer corps came from the upper middle class. And so there was a class system between the officers and the enlisted. But what no one ever really talks about too much is why would those groups be isolated or kept separate? And one of the reasons those groups are kept separate is because one group puts the other group in danger. The leaders, the officer corps is the one telling people charge the hill. They give that job to the platoon sergeant and then he gets everybody to do it. But there's actually a sort of de-circuiting of empathy going on. You may love your troops as a leader, but you've got to tell them, or you've been told that your job is to tell them to go attack that hill or defend that ridge or whatever. Their lives are in danger. So in order for you to be able to give those kind of orders where you know that potential outcome is quite risky, it's almost as if the system of the military, it's not that the officer corps has to dehumanize the enlisted, it's just set up the way they communicate, that this group says to do it this way, and then the first lieutenant or the lieutenant and the platoon sergeant, they're the conduit to get from the officer corps to the enlisted. So are they separate or even less than human? I'm sure that there are plenty of officers who have been seen as quite inhumane when they tell their troops that there's certain things they have to do. So I'm just trying to be descriptive here. I'm not trying to tell you officers enlisted, there's a value difference. It's just in terms of how these systems function, they seem to be set up so that objectives can be achieved with the least amount of risk possible. I'll shut up there, but I just thought I wanted to throw that up. Anyone else on that question?
I think that the perfectionism that's expected of leaders is what is othering. Thinking about how everything is Shakespeare, right? I know that you were mentioning, Stephen, how the right is guilty for making emotions taboo and saying that we don't need to deal with these things. But I also think about cancel culture, right? With like with the left, and how when people make mistakes, no matter how minor or big, it's kind of on to the next one, and we're no longer listening to anything else they have to say, acknowledging any of the previous work that they did, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
No, I was gonna say, like you said, it's not simple, it's complex, right?
Right.
But we fall back on that simplicity because it's easy. But I think what you said about leaders is true. But the thing I was gonna add is, I think it does create a kind of othering, and it's a necessary one, right? Because you are sort of sending people into battle, and the moment that breaks down is you have a mutiny, right? When troops stop seeing their leaders as above them or an other or something to look up to, then you have a mutiny. So it is, I think that's probably one of the reasons, that expectation of them having to.
This idea that you're talking about, that we're talking about, if I go left for a second, it's not going to be too far. But there is a scene in like episode 250 of One Piece, the animated series, that does this very issue when Luffy and Usopp get in a fight about the death of the Going Merry. And it's a brutal fight. And it goes on, and Usopp stops. And then Luffy starts bawling his eyes out. And of course, you empathize. He loves his crew. he's bawling his eyes out, and he says, in the middle of his bawling, he says, that was hard. And Zorro, who's his first lieutenant, says to him, don't lose yourself in this. If we can't trust you, who can we trust? And I like, damn, that was brutal. But that's if you're going to be a leader, right? These are the things that are somewhat demanded of the position. I'm not trying to say anything, make any value judgments here. But if you're going to be in a system that engages in violence, state-sanctioned violence, and you're going to put people's lives at risk, the stakes are so incredibly high that I think the system of organizations that you see in the military are as they are because the stakes are so high. And I think other organizations have leadership systems that dissipate because the stakes aren't nearly as high, right? And I won't even comment about academia. We'll just move on from that one. Any other questions or comments on that issue of officers or leaders?
I will just add, kind of to solve the blow kind of a little. I think about in medical fields. If you guys haven't watched The Pet, highly recommend it, because there is a price to be a leader too. There is a price that you pay that in psychology we call it moral injury, right? There is gonna be times that we have to that go against everything that we believe in order to save the majority. It's not even to save the good or bad, it's just to save the majority, right? And what this says, do we think that is an accurate display? I will say it's more like a journal display. You know, each one of us will see the same scene, as we have noticed. We see the same scene a little different depending on the lens of our own experiences, because we cannot see life through somebody else's glasses because it's gonna look blurry. Unless you get little by little, do you see better with this glass or with this glass? So when we talk about leaders in military, we have to also remember how little to nothing we know from that culture. Also, how we have, because they have been either demonized or not, right? And we have to also consider the systems that are broken in between. But that's what I use the Pet or Andor. You want the perfect chess kiss. Andor is like, you know, he didn't want to be a leader. He had to become a leader. And it took for a long time. So is history repeating itself? History always repeats itself because, again, brain. We stay in our comfort zone, and comfort zone is always me, and not you.
Exactly. So thank you for that, everyone. We actually have about 4 or 5 more questions, so I'm gonna read them out. Someone jump in with an answer if that's okay, and then I'll try to get through all of these. We've got about 20 minutes. I think we'll have time, but. So this is from Daniel Love. Do you think his personal struggles, I'm going to talk about the Matador here, right? Do you think his personal struggles like grief and isolation reflect his own struggle against being othered? It's also the fact that he's literally fighting monsters.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, you know, it's a serial thing. So his character arc, but a lot of it's the point is that there are always going to be monsters, right? And he's fighting these to, you know, I always say he's fighting to make a better world for his daughter. And one of the things that as she gets older, he has to realize is that you're basically chasing windmills, right? You're never going to be able to protect your children from everything. No. And as she gets older, the more you try to do that and hide them from the world, it becomes more and more toxic to them. Because you're not allowing them to grow, you're not giving them the tools to survive. You're trying in a way to sort of like live their life for them, you know.
Yeah.
So thematically, that's definitely something that fits.
So first of all, I love when you guys say there's always going to be monsters, right? That ties directly to the notion of it's all Shakespeare from top to bottom. It depends on what you think life is, right? In other words, if we're living systems and then there's some clean non-living space that we can go to when we die, then reality has these 2 different kind of spaces. And however, if we're living in one reality and when we end, we basically get recycled into everyone else's systems, then you just don't develop this binary view of good, bad, of heaven and earth. You recognize that all the beauty exists in the ugly, and that's a different way of seeing things that you don't often see consciously portrayed in Western narrative. You see it in a lot of indigenous narrative, right? But you tend not to see it in a lot of Western narrative. And I'll stop there and see if any of you want to react to that idea. But I think it's an important one.
Yeah, and it also kind of reminded me, thinking of the question, I'm thinking more of Jeffrey Cohen's monster theory, more precisely when he talks about like how the monster also represents that threshold of becoming. In other words, how fighting the monster is a reflection back of how we're forming our own identities and reconstructing that identity. So it's also interesting to think about that, whether or not we stop seeing this as the binary, that we have to stop this evil and stop the monsters, more so the reasons of why collectively we are, battling these monsters, but then what do we lose and gain throughout that process? So it's really interesting thinking about it and adding it in that framework and going back to like, well, grief and isolation and kind of like international struggles, like what do we gain and lose throughout this violence and concept and constant combat.
I can only agree with you. For a system to basically sustain itself on the work of people outside of that system who come into that system, what we might call illegally, but we're welcoming them, we're harvesting their energy and turning it into wealth for ourselves, right? For that system to then go back and tell them they're here illegally and they need to leave now is massively incoherent. Right? I'm not going to go into the language of right and wrong. What I'm going to say is it's a brutal contradiction, and it makes it difficult to experience the "they need to leave" statement as being any sense aware of the fact that your ability to stand there and live the life that you're living and say they need to leave is completely dependent on that having been here for generations, doing the work that they've done, sustain the context that affords you an ability to tell them they need to leave. So when you find such incoherence in the way people talk, where they're contradicting themselves, then we start making up our own stories about what the hell is actually going on. And the stories that we end up saying end up feeling like the same damn thing over and over again. It's the same thing over and over, dressed up to look rational. So, I'll stop there. I think, we're living in some pretty incoherent times. And that's a philosopher talking. We'll stop there. If we have two questions, guys, I want to share my frame and then we'll do these two questions, all right? Because my frame might be something that brings a little levity to this conversation because by the way, I absolutely love the conversation. And to my panelists, I'll thank you again, but I appreciate your openness and these conversations are alive, but I absolutely love this frame and you guys can see it, right? All right, and the reason I love this frame is because it's and look, Mucha Lucha characters may have become heroes in comic books before this. I have no clue, but you have Monster Matador, and then you have a new generation of people from a culture who are, in a sense, joining in the fight against what we call monsters. I just thought it was very fun, and I'll leave it at that. If anyone wants to comment on it.
It was, for me, this is one of my favorite panels too, and it's a nod and an homage to Santo, who is obviously the great Mexican luchador who fought monsters himself in many, many, many films. So,
all right,
and he always drove a convertible, and it's very well dressed.
No, very well dressed, and it kind of couples generations, right? Generations of heroism, which is a lot of fun. Anyone else want to comment on that image? All right, I'll stop sharing that. We'll go to the questions.
Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, sir.
I was going to say, yes, I have the whole of the lucha libre kind of thing, but most than that, I like this frame too because it's a representation almost like the Chicano movement. You know, we are like the second, third generation, and we're in our Cadillacs, and we're rambunctious and proud and loud. And at the same time, we have so much history behind us. And in Latino culture, especially not anymore, but the low riders and stuff like that is something that is so prideful for a lot of generations of the males that didn't went to the militia and stuff like that. So it's a way of expression. And the same, I love this because you have female and male representation, and also like that whole old school flair of the Santo Blue Demon and the demons and the Dracula thing. So even the little birds in the background that is also in the Blue Demon movies. I really appreciate this. This is a fun one.
That's fantastic. Stop sharing. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. We have 2 more questions. Oh, does someone want to comment? I'm sorry. Oh, I thought I heard someone. Okay, so we have Trinice Gaden asks, well, since it's considered books of history, do you think this comic accurately displays how othering is in our society now? Is history repeating itself? And we'll go with Sara for that, since you're the one that brought up the idea of being books of history.
So, hold on. Well, since it's considered this book of history, yes, it's history. It's depends how you see it, because, and this is gonna be like, Steve is gonna say, oh, but I thought you love my book. But because nobody's asking the monsters, right? Nobody's asking the monsters why do we have to be killed? Why we are just trying to survive, procreate, and be, right?
Yeah.
And then depending on what side of the history of the Latinx culture you are, you find things about the Matador representative like, oh, you know, so it depends of the context of the person. That's what I say. This is the journal of somebody. And it depends if you were the person, like if I am one of the monsters, I will not like this story. Right? But if I'm the Matador, I will be the story. And when I said, and this is what I always tell my students, history, be careful because it depends who's writing it. It depends what lens you're seeing it. Right? And we're seeing that right now. So is this opinion of itself history? Yeah, because it depends who you ask. That's how they take it. But what I appreciate the most out of the comic is that representation is there. My color is there. My people is there. And if you haven't seen the last year, the same convention that we have today, you will know why I love so much this. Even though somebody will argue with me because I'm indigenous, how can I like somebody that is so Hispanic and so Spain, you know? Which, because if you think about it, Spanish to us is not good. We are not the good people, but I always say I'm half Mayan, half Hispanic, so I'm the good guys and the bad guys. Depends who you ask.
Well said.
Because for some, we're the savage. For some, we're the roots of the earth. And for others, we are like the conquistadores or the colonizers. Or we are the ones that brought religion. So it depends who you ask, right? So that will be my answer to like the display of the othering. Depends who you ask. I always believe that everybody is trying their best, but depending on the systems that they have been brought up, they will change, and some will become the demons, the monsters of somebody's lives. And not to get out of context, but Demon Slayer does this perfectly in that sense of like the best therapist that you can have is Shakiro. So for this one, I would say ask two people and you will get 2 different answers. You have five of us here and you get different answers depending on the lens that we are seeing it with. So in that sense, history always repeats itself because we're going to see how it's more appropriate to us in our story.
Anyone want to respond to Dr. Roldan?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, it is a matter of perspective, right? There's a very famous, and I don't remember it, but description of the Wizard of Oz, which basically frames it as, the Wicked Witch being just the victim and Dorothy being the antagonist. And it is, you could take any story, and depending on how you've been raised and who, what your view of the world is, you would see maybe the hero is the villain and the villain is the hero, and and that's always the struggle, right? Is what is right, what is good. And...
Wow, what a great conversation, you guys. Because there's two ways to go from what you guys are saying here. One way to go is, well, we just need to try harder to not have a perspective. We need to see things as they are. And that's the Western sort of curse, is that we're eventually going to see reality as it is with no boundaries coming from ourselves. But another way is to say boundaries in our experiences are inescapable. And we can actually only have experiences because we generate boundaries through which experiences can happen. That leads to a different question. Well, damn, if we're all going to have boundaries, are we done? And the answer is no. We can develop boundaries that entail mutual respect, right? And we can cultivate and stop calling people flawed. Stop saying that people see things with errors. People be. Capital B-E, people be, and being necessitates we have a perspective. So let's cultivate having perspectives that entail mutual respect, as opposed to calling the other side evil so we can dehumanize. I think we have one more question, and I think this will work. This is from Madeline Zimmerman. Do you think that grief itself acts as a force that others, those who feel it, because it is so separating from everyday norms in society? Now, you all have access to the chat, so you can see that. Does anyone want me to read that again?
Mm-mm.
Okay, then anybody who wants to answer that, jump on in.
I think that grief can be othering because of the conversation that we were having earlier about the way that trauma changes who you are, especially when you don't deal with it and you push it down instead. It can be hard to discover who you truly are, right? Become more of that aboutness and more about who you truly are when you are still so attached to the things that you went through and haven't quite teased yourself apart from those things and away from that context.
Anyone want to follow up on that?
I think grief, any emotion, really can be very isolating because we tend to be very focused on our own idea and how it affects us. And part of what people like Dr. Roldan do in therapy allows us is to see that we are not alone in our grief. We are not alone in our experience, and that there are others who share that. So.
Well, wow.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Edcel. Please go ahead.
Well, so now that we're all discussing this as like grief being that force of othering, honestly, we can make the argument that I'm thinking of Inside Out too, specifically, any emotion on its own can be that force of othering. And even Inside Out 1, like, if anger was like the main emotion, Riley would have like escaped. So that itself would have been a force of othering. Same with anxiety in Inside Out 2. And I think what I like about that movie is how multifaceted joy is in both movies, and kind of like realizing, wow, even though I've moved away and learned from Inside Out 1, I'm still kind of like that force of control that's still trying to gauge and make Riley happy in Inside Out 2. And I'd like to think of grief, like the whole concept of othering, as that too, kind of like how one emotion can completely other us and change us completely when we lean to that without the proper help and support that we get from therapy and mental health checks. So I completely agree with that.
I would like to add I'm gonna go against the grain. So feelings are signals, but grief, instead of othering, is one of those forces that unify, because there's nobody in this world that has not felt grief. That we want to hide it, that's a different thing. But grief is a collection of many, many feelings and sensations, but we all have felt grief. All of us in one grief because your balloon fly when you were 5 years old, like when it flew, or like you move a different state, or you didn't get into university, or you did lose a person, or your loving pet. The part of grief that it creates the othering is the meaning that we give to the grief, meaning you lost your pet, oh, it's not that bad because I lost this. So it's that competition that it generates, because all we want is to be seen and say, I went through something like that too. So I don't believe grief is the othering per se, as much as society has decided that we cannot show any kind of togetherness.
Very well said. That's why when you watch a movie like Black Panther 2, when they're celebrating the death of T'Challa, they have a ritualized pattern they go through so that nobody has to consciously tell anybody how to grieve. They collectively have a ritual they go through where you can bring your sorrows to the river and you collectively heal each other. In a sense, kind of losing your sense of self in the midst of a ritual, well, then lets your grief become something that's shared. And having an implicit ritual that trains us how to deal with grief makes it less of a personal battle, right? But when we don't have those cultural rituals, then we're trying to think our way through it, and that's it's hard for one person to just think their way through it. Well, hey, I don't know if Teams is going to cut us off exactly at 7:30. I know I'm sitting here saying your meeting has 5 minutes left. So what I want to do now is kind of bring this wonderful conversation to a close. Stephen, first of all, thank you so much for doing this fantastic book, and thank you so much for coming back again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fantastic. And
I'm glad you enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.
It's always a lot of fun. And then Edcel, Raven, and Dr. Roldan, thank you so much for being here. I know Edcel and Dr. Sara were here last year when we talked about a different Monster Matador book. It's really good to see the two of you again, and I love listening to what you have to say on these topics. So thank you so much for being here. Raven, this was your first time. What did you think?
Oh, it was so much fun. It was great talking with everyone and hearing everybody's perspective. And this is my new favorite comic. It's my first one. How could it not be?
That's fantastic. And just so everyone knows, this is what ReggieCon's all about, are these conversations. And I love the fact that we do it virtually, because the virtual medium has unleashed high amplitude binaries into our world in ways that it was hard to have access to such high amplitude, intense negativity. You had to get the whole village together with pitchforks and shovels, right? But now you just sit in front of your computer and bam. And so my mission in ReggieCon is to sort of put a competing vibe in that space and celebrate the after dinner 2 glasses of wine conversation that doesn't have a beginning or an end, but just continues in the name of what we call culture. So thanks for all of you for being here, and everybody look out for the next date for our next ReggieCon episode. Until then, speak Scott. Have a good evening. Thanks for coming.